Listening is more than hearing. It is an expression in our presence in the room. Based on this factor, we ask that while in the learning space, you silence your phone. If you do need to text or talk on the phone, we ask that you respectfully take a step outside of the meeting to attend to those communications. So there you have it, friends, 6 relatively simple guidelines and expectations for student conduct in these spaces. These rules apply to individuals and groups that are not students as well, and we will be sure to enforce these should poor conduct occur from any person. Thank you for coming, and now I will turn it over to our amazing presenter.
Thank you, O'Shea, Senator Burning Ground. Folks, I'm so delighted to be with you here today. I want to just start by saying that because we have a relatively intimate group in this space, I think what I'll do is I'll lead us through some prompt questions and sort of a hyper focus, and then open it up so we can engage in a dialogue because you're here because something's on your mind, or perhaps you're writing a paper for a class. Does that sound all right? Wonderful. So speech activity can evoke myriad emotional and intellectual responses. It is one of the most misunderstood and complex topics college campus leaders face. Today's panel seeks to do a couple of things: share information and educate us on what we can do and cannot do with regard to speech activity on campus. And it's my hope that illuminating these nuances and challenges will foster a sense of we are in this together and we can find common ground on our campus. So my colleagues hold representative roles across the institution, from law enforcement, legal counsel, student support, campus events, marketing and communication, academics, specifically in the School of Journalism. And I want to thank our panelists in advance for bringing their expertise today. And because our time is limited, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself as you respond to a prompt. And so I'll begin by letting the group know that my name is Leslie Webb. I'm new to the University of Montana. I've been here for 2 months, and I serve as the Vice Provost for Student Success and Campus Life. Thank you for joining us. So the session title is "What does free speech mean at the University of Montana?" And President Bodnar shared this quote with the campus community: "In practice, this means that we will sometimes encounter ideas that provoke, anger, or wound us. Protecting the right of free expression can therefore sometimes conflict with our strong commitment to foster a campus that is welcoming and inclusive. This is a challenging tension with which we grapple as a society and a university." So this is my question, panelists. What do you believe is the most challenging aspect as we navigate this tension? And I'd like to invite us to use the microphone just for those who may need some amplification.
Sure, thank you. So I'm Lucy France, I'm the legal counsel at the university. So I'm gonna take a little bit of time to unpack this, and I'm gonna do it by way of an example. And I really appreciate this opportunity. So we have, 3 branches of government, the judicial branch, and so I'm going to highlight 2 cases, very fact-specific cases from the 4th Circuit. Does anybody know? We're in the 9th Circuit. Does anybody know where the 4th Circuit is? Virginia. So these are 2 cases from Virginia that I think illustrate what we're trying to unpack, and that's, it'll be helpful. So one is from 1993. It's called Iota Chi Chapter of Sigma Chi versus George Mason University. So, and I'm going to simplify the facts a little bit. So a fraternity held a very derogatory, very offensive kind of, I don't know what you call it, just scene. They used blackface. They called it the Ugly Women's Contest. And it really offended a lot of people. And I'm not going into the really, I think, horrible facts and terribly offensive facts. And the university put the fraternity on suspension and issued other sanctions against the fraternity because it had created a hostile environment. As you know, we're a public institution of higher education. We have responsibilities under many federal and state laws to not discriminate and to make sure we're not deliberately indifferent if we see discrimination in a hostile environment. So objectively, this could have caused somebody, to feel that they are not welcome on this campus. The fraternity sued, and they held that the fraternity skit, although low-grade entertainment and sophomoric, was afforded First Amendment protection. The court held, quote, the university should have accomplished its goals in some fashion other than silencing speech on the basis of its viewpoint. Let's contrast that in 2018 to another case, Feminist Majority Foundation versus Hurley. So the Feminist Majority Foundation was a student group, and they had initially protested the university certifying a male fraternity, and then held a lot of protests about just sort of machismo and that they said the university wasn't doing enough to combat sexual assault and sexual harassment on campus. I'm simplifying the facts, but they were active and some of their members were very active. So the facts and the details are very important in each of these cases. Another fact that I think is critically important in this case is a horrible fact that unconnected to this, one of the leaders of the feminist organization's roommate killed her. Not connected to this, but that's a fact. People in the public, this got a lot of publicity, didn't know that it wasn't connected. So essentially there's just a foundation of fear because the fraternity members and the rugby team openly, said derogatory things, created lots of scenes, lots of protests, you can imagine, on this campus. In that case, the court held that the plaintiffs, so the feminist organization, sued the campus saying you didn't do enough. I mean, the campus held listening sessions, the president talked to people, they issued statements of their values, things like that. And the plaintiffs sued and said, you didn't do enough. We sue you under Title IX for discrimination. And the court let that move forward. That's the case, and those are the facts. Ironically, I was just telling Professor Banville that the person who represented the plaintiffs in this case wrote the book, Free Speech on College Campuses, and he normally, he's a part of the institution. He's a dean at a law school, at one of the most prominent law schools. So anyway, I think I spent so much time on this because I think that illustrates the tension and how fact-specific these things are from my perspective.
My name is Brad Giffen. I'm the chief of police here at the University of Montana. I've been here for about 8 years. I was at the sheriff's office in Missoula for 26 years prior to that. As far as what I believe, I think the perspective I'm going to give you is from the person who has to go out and try to enforce these situations. And one of the ways that I think is kind of a blocking point for the tension that actually is derived from speech is, number one, people lacking a clear understanding of what free speech actually is. Because I think it's defined in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people, and a lot of people have beliefs of certain things that I think there's just a big misunderstanding of what free speech actually entails, and it entails a lot. And I think the tension, and I get this from my experience as a police officer. When I respond and interact with people, usually there's people who are involved in a very emotionally attached item, whether it's a family member, whether it's a firm belief, and speech is that same way. It triggers people emotionally. And I found over the course of my career and experience that an emotional response to something usually is not very effective. If you can engage your rational brain and rationalize through something, I mean, it's much easier to make a point. And it's a point that I think is oftentimes better received by the audience, making your point in a courteous way that respects other people. So I think from my position, the most challenging aspect is, number one, making sure that other people understand what free speech entails, and then understand that when they're engaging in these issues, that there's going to be emotion. And that emotion generally takes over and creates that tension, as opposed to maybe stepping back and coming forward with a rational argument of an opposing view. that seems to, even on the things that we experienced this fall on our campus, seem to be the most effective way to engage that group in particular. So that would be what I would say.
My name is Lee Vanville. I'm the director of the School of Journalism, and I'm also the professor who teaches the media law and First Amendment class at the journalism school. And I guess where I would say this tension most manifests itself is the First Amendment is really there, is often called a dissenters amendment. Like, speech that everybody agrees with doesn't really need to be protected because everybody agrees with it. So the First Amendment really kicks into gear. Like, when I teach this course, essentially it's a class where I'm like, and this is the time we defended the Nazis, and this is the time we defended the hateful speech, and it feels bad. It's never, somebody coming across with a message of hope and reconciliation being silenced by a I don't know, draconian state entity. It's the voices of the fringe that really do oftentimes trigger these conflicts. And those voices of the fringe are also often the voices that are saying some of the most hurtful, the most derogatory, the most damaging words. And that inherently means we have tension, right? Because on the one hand, we have a system that is built to protect those voices that we most don't want to hear. And on the flip side, it says, but the institution we don't want deciding who gets to talk is the government. The government is because if you tease it out, the fear is if the government makes decision about what is, let's say, hate speech, and I hate speech, and yet the argument goes, if you allow the government to say this speech is not okay, this viewpoint is not okay, then is your speech right contingent on who wins elections? Because that is the fear, right? That yes, right now I really don't want the neo-Nazis to march through a town in Illinois that houses an enormous number of Holocaust survivors. This was a case with Skokie, Illinois in the 70s. And yet on the flip side, I don't want the government to silence Black Lives Matter protesters who are speaking out against systemic racial injustice. And yet drawing the line around one oftentimes threatens the other. And so what we see is it's really hard to draw lines. And yet we also recognize that, so the default position is let everybody talk, but that also creates an environment where it does run directly into what President Bodnar has outlined, which is we want to be a welcoming and tolerant campus. So how do you welcome and tolerate speech that is inherently intolerant and unwelcoming? Like, doesn't that conflict with itself? And the short answer is it does. And so, I think as Brad mentioned, I mean, the solution, the only solution that really has come from many of these cases is the solution to bad speech is more good speech. But that is this oddly dissatisfying answer, but it's still the one that we keep coming back to. And so that tension, especially on college campuses, is it's, in a place of higher education and higher learning, it becomes that sort of, that marketplace of ideas, but it also becomes a bit of a battlefield of ideas. And that battlefield can really manifest itself in some really hurtful and hateful ways. And so I don't envy the two people to my right who have to set the policies and then enforce those policies to try and figure out how do you draw these lines, because inherently there is these sort of conflicting, I mean, they're going to be in conflict. It's just like privacy and the public's right to know. They'll always be in conflict. And it's a question of how does that line move? And unfortunately, oftentimes in both cases, people get hurt, whether it's emotionally or, I mean, we hope not physically, but there's often hurt on both sides of those conversations, because when you draw the line somewhere, somebody ends up on the other side of it. And that's a very mushy general picture, but I think that that's kind of where I come from on the tension side.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. Dave Koontz, Director of Strategic Communications. I think when we think about the most challenging aspect of as we navigate this tension, it's really understanding the university's role in these conflicts. And as those who spoke before me rightfully pointed out, the role of the government in these free speech issues. I think as we face difficult circumstances on our campus, it's important to remember that in these situations, we are the government, and it's our responsibility to follow the laws that are there, the policies that Lucy and her team have worked so hard to put in, and make sure that we are treating situations in a manner that's consistent and content neutral, even if it feels like at times it's at odds with our DEI objectives, which is largely the case. And so as we wrestle with different situations year in and year out, it really puts us in a tough position where it feels as a spokesperson for the university, or as we deal with some of our statewide elected leaders, as we feel that pressure, is just making sure we do a better job at communicating what our role is as a university, what our role is and the government, and making sure that as we make difficult decisions and actions, that they're coming from a place that's content neutral. And while we can still make progress on the university's DEI plans and objectives, that we don't, as Lee was just talking about, take steps or set precedences that can have long-term negative impact against things that can ultimately hurt our DEI goals. So I think that's something that as we wrestle with these things as they pop up on an individual basis, are things we're always considering.
Hi, I am Adrienne Smith. I'm the director of the University Center, and I'm going to, just tag along to what Dave was talking about and just take it a little bit further, because my role, along with Shannon, who's here in the audience, is so when someone comes onto campus to exercise their right to free speech, we would want them to schedule, but not necessarily they have to. So, and our role is to navigate often these events or someone's right to exercise their right to free speech. And we run, I guess, interference oftentimes with individuals in the campus community. And so the challenge is here is, our role is to remain content neutral, right? That's very important for Shannon's office and her team, is to remain content neutral in scheduling the events. Should they schedule? If they don't schedule, that's okay as well. It's not a requirement that individuals that come onto campus schedule. But the challenge here is we want to still prioritize student safety and well-being. And how can we do that when we've heard that sometimes the language and the speech that's happening is not always inclusive. But we still also need here is to still uphold the law and the ideals of free speech, and affirm the educational value of intellectual curiosity and engaging with ideas across differences. So, but all these things could be in conflict, right? So how do we manage those three things? It can be quite challenging. So that's where it becomes quite challenging. It becomes quite a balancing act. So I think that's, I would say, for our team, is definitely some of the biggest challenges. Is oftentimes we're out seen as protecting the rights of those who are engaging in hateful speech, when really we're trying to manage all three of those components. we are trying to prioritize the safety and well-being of students in the campus community, while we are also trying to uphold the law and the ideals of free speech. And at what point do we run interfere? At what point is it interfering with the educational value? And so balancing all three can be quite difficult. So, yeah. And at what point do we make a call that the free speech is interfering in the educational value of the institution? So.
Hey everybody, my name is Selena. I'm the Director of Inclusive Excellence for Student Success. I also sit on the bias response team, which is a new team on the University of Montana campus. And as the Director of Inclusive Excellence for Student Success, my main role is to provide advocacy and support for our students, specifically our underrepresented students on this campus. And so for me in my office, the tension is all of the things that our panel has stated, like trying to find providing the education, but also validating the experience of a person who feels targeted as they're walking to class, and a protester on our campus shouting things that actually embody everything, represent who they are. And so being in my office, not knowing that there's a protester outside, and then all of a sudden having students in my office just like totally having this emotional response that Brad had talked about, and really just trying to give them space to process that, and also decide if education is an important component in that moment. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes I just need to validate that experience that, okay, here you are, an underrepresented individual on this campus. You already have, you know, aspects or experiences of isolation. And at that moment in time, my job isn't to educate them about freedom of speech. However, sometimes I have to. So really that for me in my role, that's my tension is we're on a campus, we're in an institution of higher education, and where do I provide that education, and where do I just provide that support? And so I just appreciate hearing everybody's perspective, because that helps me in the role that I take on campus as well.
Thank you, Selena. So I'm going to build off that a little bit here. So in a recent national survey by Gallup and the Knight Foundation, a majority of students appear to prefer an environment in which their institution is expected to create an environment that shelters them from offensive views. Panelists, what do you think? Who would like to? Brad will start.
So my opinion on this is that sheltering people from offensive views doesn't really educate anyone. It just doesn't. If you don't prepare people for the real world, I don't think that when you get out of the university system, you're going to be exposed to all kinds of different things and all kinds of different people. And if you travel, all kinds of different cultures, and to shelter yourself from things that you find offensive, I think is the wrong approach. When I think of education, I think of educating myself in the whole, right? Understanding what my beliefs and my opinions are, but certainly being willing to listen to what someone else might have to say, because I might get something from that. So I do think it's valuable to have people have experiences, especially experiences where they're, I think, tasked a little bit to communicate in a very difficult situation. Effective communications really for everything that you do in life is critical. And understanding, I already touched on this, but I find it to be so important and so almost invaluable in the job that I do, is trying as best you can to separate that emotion from the reason or the rational part of your brain, so that you can actually have a conversation dealing with very difficult people. And Adrienne, I think she was tested this autumn and did a fantastic job in doing just exactly that. Being able to listen to things that I think probably bothered her. I can't speak for her, but I think some of those things bothered a lot of people. But she used a very calm and rational and reasonable tone and engaged in a conversation that eventually led to the tone of the whole thing coming down. So I don't believe in sheltering people from things. I did start out my career in the Marine Corps. I have traveled around the world in many countries. And I think that when you take away that ability to experience, especially in a controlled environment, a conversation that's going to be difficult and figuring out a way to deal with that difficult situation, this is probably one of those situations. I can't think of too many other situations except enforcement situations where keeping your emotions in check, listening intently to what they have to say, and responding with a rational opinion of your own, I think that provides big dividends. So I wouldn't be in support of a protective place.
I think, so a lot of this is all about the specific. Who wouldn't like to be sheltered by things that are offensive? I mean, I would, but what do I consider offensive versus what someone else considers offensive? You know, I think of, well, I do want to, I mean, before I go too far down this road, and I won't go too far down this road, it's important. I think there was an interesting additional study, I don't think it was this survey, that found the First Amendment was really popular among people who look like me, because it's often benefited people who look like me, straight, middle-aged white guys. And so I think it's important, and it is less supported among groups that have felt targeted and often targeted by the speech that the First Amendment protects. And I think that is an issue, and I think it's an issue that we have to think about, and an issue that, I mean, I try to address in a class where I teach about this, but I think it's something we really need to recognize, that the First Amendment has often benefited this guy. And so I think, and has been perceived to be protecting me from, that I can say whatever I want. And we don't all have equal access to this marketplace of ideas. So with that in mind, I think the one thing that I would stress is offensive is a real mushy term. The Supreme Court famously created a concept called the fighting words doctrine. And it was created because a guy had spoken to someone like Brad and called him, please cover your ears, a racketeer and a socialist. And the Supreme Court said that was speech that was so provocative that the only thing a person could possibly do is punch the person who called you a racketeer, and therefore it is not protected by the First Amendment. What was that decision really about? Was that person who had called the police officer in New Hampshire a racketeer had been assaulted by a gang of people who were angry that he was proselytizing the Jehovah Witness faith. Is that offensive? Well, I mean, maybe, but is it an okay reaction to threaten him, to try and spear him with an American flag? And then when the police do nothing and the guy says, you're being a jerk, police officer, that the guy who got almost speared is the one who gets in trouble because he's the offensive one. You know, when you use terms like offensive, it creates sort of this prism that, offensive to each of us means something different. And so when the law comes in and says, okay, this is what offensive means, you might not agree with it, or you might be the one who's actually offensive. And that is where I think the problem with that is, because defining these things is oftentimes personal through experience, like Selena was talking about, like through personal experience that a person has gone through. They're going to have a different perception of what offensive is than someone who hasn't or has had different experiences. And so drawing a legal line becomes really difficult because of that.
So I want to say, I think, acknowledge that one of the things that we do here is we bring all kinds of people together. That's a good thing on an academic. I mean, that's one of the things that education provides. We bring people from different backgrounds. With that comes this tension. I want to acknowledge and say that there are no shortcuts. That's basically what the Supreme Court and what the law says. There are no shortcuts. We're not going to silence speech. We're not going to, on one end, just say it's just the marketplace of ideas, like Lee said. On the other side, we're not going to stop speech. I think I'm going to just give a shout out again to the hard work. You heard Selena and Adrian and Brad on the front lines here. There are other ways that we can support and respect where people are coming from without silencing speech. and I'm going to leave it to my colleagues who are on the ground doing the hard work. But I do want to acknowledge that this is a good thing. We don't want institutions that are, things aren't binary. We want institutions that do provoke, and that where different people from different socioeconomic statuses, different race, religions, sexual orientations, gender identities come together and learn from one another. But with that creates tension. And I'm just going to put out there that I think that's a good thing.
Would anyone over here want to share their thoughts about that?
I actually do a really good job being neutral, content neutral, when I'm working with the groups that come onto campus. However, if I had my way, some of the individuals that come on campus, I actually wouldn't have up here. I'm going to just put myself out there and say that. I actually disagree. I don't think they should be. I wish we could say you can't come onto campus. I see how they trigger individuals. I actually talk to the students who are impacted, and they are impacted by these individuals. They are impacted greatly. And it's the impact that is felt is real. Okay. It is whether it is, we cannot walk in their shoes and know the impact that is felt by some of what is heard and screened at these students. However, there is a law. There are laws, and and this is when I talk to the students, I am there when I put myself between the speakers and the students. I engage with the students, and I'm able to talk with the students, and I'm able to explain to the students what is happening. And that's my job, and that's our job as employees on this campus. And that's what I'm talking about, the well-being, putting the well-being of the students. Our job is to explain that to the students and to tell the students, I care about you, right? I'm here and I care about you. And I'm here in between you and the speaker. And I understand what's being said is not what you want to hear, but there is a law, and we do have to allow this speech to happen. I don't want to hear this any more than what you want to hear it, but it is what we have to allow. Not only are there, the free speech is a law, but there's also has been 2 laws passed in the state of Montana in the last year's legislation that also has taken it a little bit further. It was HB 349 and HB 218 that specifically addresses allowing free speech on college campuses. And that addresses that we can't have a free speech zone, that the entire outdoor of our campus is free speech, as well as making sure that we are not targeting, that we're allowing it all student group organizations, regardless of their religious viewpoint, their conservative viewpoint, any viewpoint, to have access to free speech. In remaining content neutral. Of course, we've always, since I've been here for 20 years, I feel like we've always been really good at that. I don't think we've ever have not been content neutral. I think we've always been very good at following what I felt was federal law in that aspect. And I think our role here again is just to be as honest running that, you know, what Selena was talking about, it's unfortunate that we have to tell students sometimes go there and say, it is legally, this is the law. But be that in between. I'm here, I'm in between you and this person speaking the hate speech. But they're gonna be allowed to do it.
Do you mind if I build on that?
Yeah.
First, I want to acknowledge something, if you don't mind, and I so deeply appreciate, Adrian, what you said, because what you did for us on the panel and you did in this space is to humanize the rules that we have, right? Sometimes it can feel like the folks sitting up here might be part of a bureaucracy that's so big, that's impenetrable. And I think that what Adrian just did is to help humanize the challenges that we face with our own personal perspectives and the roles that we play in an institution, publicly funded institution of higher education. And I'm deeply grateful for that. So thank you. I want to follow up, and I'm just really sort of keenly aware of our time. I want to build on that a little bit, and I want to ask a very specific question. Would we ever interfere with speech activity? You alluded to it a little bit about when would we do that? Why would we do that? And so I want to ask our expert here to address that. Would we ever interfere with speech activity? And what would it take for us to do so? Does anyone want to take a stab back?
I can just say no. We would.
Like you always do.
I would say no. And the reason I would say it is because if it crosses the line and we can show, and those are the two cases, that it is creating a hostile environment, it's harassment, that's not speech. So I would just say no.
I mean, so there are ways to draw rules. So there's a thing called time, place, and manner restrictions, right? And so, which are limits. I mean, permissible speech, but you can't do it here right now when I want to, as loud as I can. And yeah, there's this famous case that actually sounds like we lose, but actually we're given a roadmap for how we draw these rules. It's called Snyder v. Phelps. It's about the Westboro Baptist Church. They're horrible. That's my free speech. And they got sued for inflicting emotional damage on a guy who was burying his dead son. And these protesters protested it. He sued them, won a bunch of money, and the court said, no, you can't sue them for just speaking. But then John Roberts, who wrote the decision, said, but you can draw lines around where and when people can speak, so long as you've heard the phrase content neutral and it's not accidental. That's like talk about like a fast way to lose a court case is to say you can speak but you can't because of what you're saying. I think there are ways to limit, but it has to be clear, it has to be content neutral, it has to be reasonable, it has to not silence all of the speech. But there is a sort of roadmap, but you have to be really careful because there are people who are deliberately trying to test these, specifically on college campuses. There's an effort to really target colleges around these free speech issues. And so, I mean, it is possible, but it is hard. You have to be super careful because really there are activists who are looking for opportunities to go after universities when they draw a line that isn't perfect. And so, but I think you can do it, but you have to really be careful and really follow those kinds of restrictions.
Thank you.
Yeah, going off of, I think they look for.
There are activists that really do look for you to break. Yeah, they're looking for you to mess up. And I agree with Lucy, is you really need to be careful and not, I mean, it's a really close call to not interfere with someone's right to free speech. I think giving them just asking them to move, so following time, place, and manner, asking them to just relocate if they're interfering with classes. So the case that we had most recently was that we were getting reports that classes had to cancel class because it was interfering with instruction. So we were asking them just to relocate. So, but not to shut down their speech, just to relocate. And also, if there's an event already scheduled, they can't disrupt an event that's already scheduled. So they can't just show up and say, well, we want this spot, and disrupt an event that's already scheduled. So I also asked someone to relocate because that's exactly what they were doing. They're like, well, I want to be outside where this event's being held. And I said, well, you can't do that. Someone else already has a space scheduled. So I asked that individual to also relocate. So there are some times that we can, not necessarily, we don't want to shut down their speech, but it's the time, place, and manner situation.
We could spend half a day here, I imagine. I want to honor the fact that, and I wish that we had that half day, because I think there's so many things that we could unpack in all these intersections, but I want to honor that you may have a burning question. And so is there something that's on your mind that would be helpful while you have these esteemed panelists and experts in this space that you'd like to ask about? Okay. Wait.
Thanks. So my name is Madeline Staples, but one of my questions, which I think a lot of other students have had questions about, is about a month or so ago, there was a very, very vocal protester, or I don't know what you would call him, a person who was very like loud, aggressive, hostile towards students. And I was just wondering what you guys thought about that situation.
We thought a lot of things. Selena, would you be willing to share your perspective?
Yeah, as a Native person on this campus, that was my first reaction, right? Was, why is this person allowed to come onto this campus and speak to any individual in this way, whether they identified with some of the derogatory things the protester was saying or not. So that was just my initial reaction. I want to go back to that marketplace, and I hope it ties it in the way I'm thinking about it. But for our BIPOC and our gender diverse students, if you think about just even this panel, this is just the smallest portion of our army around people thinking about free speech and protecting our students and educating our students. Know that when these instances occur, we are having those conversations. We are doing our best to protect students and allow them to continue to access their education. But for our BIPOC and gender diverse students, like, this is the environment you want these things to happen in, because you do have a small army who can educate you, who can support you, who can provide you the system of support that you need. That's not going to happen when you're out, walking downtown and there's the same individual. You won't have that same structure. When you're out at shopping at Walmart, you're not going to have that same structure. And so I just encourage you to take advantage of visiting with each of us to learn more and to educate yourself, so you can educate your peers, because we can sit up here all day long and talk about what we think the experience is, but it's really the peer-to-peer education and support that is going to be the most influential when we are dealing with those types of situations, in my opinion. So.
Panelists, does anyone else want to share a final thought? And I'd like to share a couple things with our audience before we break. Brad?
So I think something that kind of lends itself to the question that the young lady asked there is, in connection with these events, no matter how offensive they are to you, it doesn't authorize you to violate the law. There are instances that were witnessed, particularly in the event that you're talking about, people spitting on people simply for their speech, and that's against the law. The person preferred not to claim victim status and file a report, but I think it's really important for people when they're talking about speech issues that when someone is expressing their opinion, and it's a legal opinion to express, it does not expose them to violence legally. That's something that happens, I think, quite frequently, and quite frequently it tends to get way out of hand. And that's why I started out the first comments that I made were the emotional part of that, putting your emotions in check. Emotions, for 36 years of law enforcement, I can tell you the majority of people that I took to jail were based on emotional reactions to things that were very difficult for them to deal with. And the same thing can happen to you when you're baited by people who are saying things that they know you are going to disagree with. And that is problematic for us. If you think for 1 minute that I want to write somebody a ticket for assault or take them to jail because they've been damaged in some sense, I mean, it's really hard. That's a very difficult thing to do, but there are laws, and it's my job to enforce the law. So that's one, and I think it's really important for people to understand that. And the last thing I would say or leave you with, and I've kind of been talking about this all along, is I truly believe that counter speech really is the antidote to speech that you don't like. And more speech, I think, is better than speech that is just not allowed. I really think that that's the way to approach these. Try as best you can to leave your emotions out of it. Don't make mistakes that could get you in legal trouble over someone's opinion. If it gets to that point, I would just give you the advice to either leave or disengage, because I see these things happen, and they happen very rapidly, and usually most people just don't expect to do that, right? You didn't go there with the expectation that you were going to be assaulting someone because of their opinion. But because they're emotional issues, that does happen. And I don't think it would be fair to talk about them to talk about free speech in its entirety if you weren't aware of the fact that you can get yourself in trouble.
Thank you. May I engage you in a quick Q&A where I ask the cues and you answer? Would you be willing? So was anything in this room that was shared today new information to you? Please. Was there anything new? Okay. There was for me. Thank you. And I spend time in this space, so that was really helpful. Second question I have is, regardless of your status as a student, as a staff member, or a faculty member, would it be helpful if we had more conversations around speech activity on campus? Would it be helpful if we provided you perhaps some landing pages with some, I don't know, frequently asked questions about speech activity and how we engage? Would you like to have us come back and do this sort of thing again? Are there any burning final questions? O'Shea, I want to honor the fact that it's supposed to end at 10 till and we're past that already. Any other burning questions for our panelists before we say a grateful thanks? Yes.
I deal with students on a daily basis. My name is Kale, and I'm the director of the gaming den downstairs. One of the big things that I always got back from my students is most of them understood free speech is protected. What they felt was a lack of support from the university as a whole. And it kind of drawed my experience back to 2017 when I was a student. I remember a speech demonstration happening, and the university at that time actually brought out allies swag and gear. I remember Shannon was out there. And that was like, I can't remember, it was a dean of students at the time, way back in the day, but like that was a huge thing for the students that I was running, and it's always imprinted in my brain. That was like, holy cow, this is the first time I've been on campus, and I saw them not necessarily take a stance, but like say, hey, students, we're here to support you in any fashion. And so has the university come back around to anything like that? Are they discuss things like that? Because I know that made an impact on me as a student. And I don't really hear much aside from Adrian or Shannon going out and trying to help these students, Selena, discussing with them. Is there a larger effort in that sense?
I'm grateful for this question. I didn't prompt him in this spot in the audience, but yes, there are folks of us sitting in this space right here that are working on, and others, who are working on strengthening our efforts to show how a university provides support to our students, especially when unexpected speakers arrive on campus. For example, what would it look like if we had a team of 8 who are trained in de-escalation and mediation to support the folks who are out there doing that work as part of their jobs. They just dropped everything to show up on the Oval to mediate and sort of work through the situation. So we're looking at standing up some more support efforts that will kind of exactly address what you observed a few years ago. So yes, absolutely. That and some, I'm going to call them media materials that we can always refer to, and a little bit more proactiveness, not a word, at the beginning of the school year, where we sort of engage in these dialogues in ways that make sense with professors and staff and folks who end up being in response. We'd rather be in a proactive place than in a responsive place. I think I can speak for many of us when we say we would prefer to do that. So we're working on that, and I'm grateful that you asked. On behalf of the panelists, that feels weird, but on behalf of us, I'm thankful that you came to attend. I'm grateful that it's being recorded, and I also would like to show my gratitude and appreciation for my colleagues at the University of Montana. So please join me in thanking them for their time.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you. Thank you.
Yeah. How do you enforce that without creating a situation that's it has all options of it.
But then not going so far as we had a big debate with my law students too about not sending out a University of Chicago statement. Because what message does that send? Oh, you've all got to just tuck it up when you walk on campus. That's I'm like, I love the students that protested against that. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you, Leslie.
Well, that was
nice. And I wish we did have half a day. We just do it like a
thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah.
See you. Bye, ladies. Thanks.
I just here I am new trying to put together a panel with absolutely nobody I know. So thank you for the helpfulness. It's just really
Well, we know each other.
yeah, perfect. I also, like I said, I'm working to put together some landing pages and stuff. I think it's sort of a policy related piece and
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm, slightly underwater at the moment.
well, yeah, in time.
But yes,
In
I'm
time.
here and I'm happy to help and try not to make it worse.
No.
I'm a wee bit underwater. Hey, how are you?
Oh, I know. or no. So, but yeah, no, I think. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Dedication, the dedication.